God Save You, Mary. And now moving up. In 1930, Managua was waking up under the shadow of the United States Marines on the Central Avenue. Ox carts kicked up dust next to the first automobiles, a modernity still shy that began to insinuate itself between dirt streets and tile roofs. Meanwhile, the Santiago Cathedral was raising its steel skeleton brought from Belgium. The work progressed so slowly that many joked that it would never be finished, without suspecting that barely a year later it would be the only thing left standing when the entire city came down. If you want to understand how Managua lived while all that began to change, accompany me on this journey. And if these types of stories interest you, subscribe to the channel to continue traveling back in time with us. Also take the opportunity to tell me in the comments from which city you are watching us and which decade you would like to explore in the next video. Managua, in the 30s, was a small capital of contained rhythm and close life. The houses remained open from early on, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the domestic murmur that went out to the street. The day began before the heat became intense, and almost everything revolved around the home. The market and the central square? The United States occupation was a visible reality. The Marines patrolled certain zones, especially the Central Avenue, but the city did not live in permanent tension. Soldiers and vendors shared the same streets, integrated into a routine that seemed stronger than the political situation. Since 1928, on that same stage, the Santiago Cathedral began to change the horizon, not with speed or constant ceremonies, but with a slow, firm, almost silent growth. Managua continued its daily life, while in the center a metallic structure began to define the future of the city. The mornings in Managua began early, when the sun barely touched the tile roofs and the air still retained some freshness. The doors opened almost at the same time, and the sound of brooms sweeping the patios marked the beginning of the day. The coffee was brewed in simple pots. The corn was prepared for the tortillas, and each family organized their tasks without a sense of hurry. As if time really was enough for everything, the city moved mainly on foot. Men with hats walked toward workshops, public offices, or small businesses. Women tended the home and talked briefly from the open doors, while children crossed the dirt streets with naturalness in a city where almost everyone knew each other. Traffic was scarce, and each encounter reinforced the sense of closeness. The central market concentrated the most intense movement of the morning: tropical fruits. Grains and bread were arranged on simple tables, and the vendors announced their products with a firm voice. News read in the newspaper or heard on the radio the previous night also circulated there. Information did not travel fast, but it did travel constantly, passing from mouth to mouth until it became part of the general conversation. On the dusty streets, ox carts maintained a slow and steady rhythm. The sound of the wheels on the dirt accompanied the day. From time to time, one of the first automobiles appeared, still few and striking, raising dust and curious looks. It was an incipient modernity that began to insinuate itself without completely displacing traditional customs. On the Central Avenue, United States Marines walked among merchants and neighbors. Their presence was evident, part of the occupation that the country was experiencing, but integrated into the daily landscape. There was no permanent spectacle, but a complex coexistence that with time had become routine. Daily life continued to impose itself over political attention. A few blocks away, the metallic structure of the Santiago Cathedral progressed slowly since 1928. The workers worked without ceremonies or grandiose announcements. The work did not stop the city. It simply grew in silence. Many observed its progress with skepticism, convinced that it would take years to complete. At the end of the day, when the heat diminished, the conversations returned to the doors of the houses. Managua repeated its cycle with constancy, while the Belgian steel skeleton continued rising over the roofs, accompanying the calm pulse of the capital. That city of low roofs slept without suspecting that its calendar was about to change forever. The construction of the Santiago Cathedral did not arise as an extraordinary spectacle, but as a coherent decision with the growth of Managua. Since 1928, the capital sought to consolidate its political and religious role with a temple that reflected its importance. The old church no longer seemed sufficient for a city that began to assert itself as the center of the country. The advance was constant, although far from being accelerated. Each day under the intense sun, the workers assembled beams, adjusted rivets, and raised columns with technical precision. The steel structure brought from Belgium stood out against the traditional constructions of heavy masonry. It was a different method, more industrial, that introduced a silent modernity in the middle of a city still marked by tradition. However, progress was slow. Limited resources and the own rhythm of the era forced them to work with patience. Among the neighbors, an almost inevitable phrase began to be repeated, that the cathedral would never be finished. It was not an open criticism, but a practical observation before a work that seemed to advance barely a few meters with the passing of the weeks. With time, that structure ceased to be a novelty. People no longer stopped to contemplate it. They simply included it in their daily route. The commerce continued to function. The carts crossed the avenue and the first automobiles raised dust while the steel continued to rise without ceremonies or constant announcements. In the middle of the United States occupation, the temple under construction acquired a discreet but firm meaning. While the Marines patrolled the central avenue, the cathedral represented cultural and religious continuity. It was not a symbol of confrontation, but of identity. It grew without speeches, integrated into the urban landscape. As a silent affirmation of permanence, the metallic sound of the work mixed with the bustle of the market and the daily conversation. For many, the work was barely a constant background in the life of the city. Nobody imagined that that structure considered slow and interminable would end up being the protagonist of an event that would transform the history of Managua forever. In 1930, the technology in Managua was simple, but it fulfilled its function. The radio began to be heard in some homes and businesses. It was not common in all the houses, but when it played, it gathered those who were nearby to listen to news of the country and abroad. The newspaper continued to be the main source of information. It circulated in the morning and passed from hand to hand in the market or in the square. The news about the United States occupation, the politics, or the economy was commented on out loud. Without haste or constant interruptions, the information traveled slowly, but firmly. It was heard on the radio. It was read in the newspaper, and then it was consolidated in the daily conversation. In that same flow entered the construction of the cathedral, whose slow advance was a frequent topic among neighbors. Technological modernity barely began to insinuate itself. Some automobiles traveled the streets. Certain areas had electricity, but the city still depended on the rhythm of the day and the closeness between people. And since we are traveling through 1930, tell me, from which city are you watching us and which decade would you like to explore after? So we continue traveling together through other eras. In 1930, Managua did not stop to think about the future. It lived concentrated on the immediate, the morning coffee, the market full of voices, the square as a meeting point, and the metallic structure that grew without haste in the center of the city. The United States occupation was part of the setting, and modernity began to insinuate itself between carts and automobiles. But none of that altered the dominant sensation. The city functioned normally. Each day seemed to confirm that the balance was maintained. The workers adjusted the steel brought from Belgium. The neighbors repeated the joke about the interminable nature of the work, and the routine followed its course. Managua advanced without drama, with a silent confidence in the continuity of its days. That daily security, almost invisible to those who lived it, was an essential part of the historical moment, and perhaps that is why it is so powerful when we look at it from today. Beyond the daily tasks, there existed something deeper in the Managua of 1930, a sensation of continuity. The city grew, yes, but it did so without visible ruptures. Each change seemed to integrate itself with naturalness, as if everything had its place within a larger order. The first automobiles did not displace the carts. They simply added themselves to the landscape. The radio did not substitute the conversation in the square. It complemented it. Even the presence of the Marines, although political and evident, did not completely alter the emotional structure of daily life. The majority remained focused on working, sustaining the home and maintaining their ties, an implicit confidence in the passage of time. People did not live pending drastic transformations. The future was not a threat or a spectacular promise. It was simply the prolongation of the present. The construction of the cathedral reflected that same mentality. It advanced slowly, but it advanced. It did not matter how long it took, because time seemed ample, available. The important thing was that it was still standing, growing along with the city. That sensation of stability, almost invisible to those who inhabited it, defined the spirit of Managua in 1930. A city that did not need to accelerate to feel in movement, and that trusted that its history would continue developing without immediate shocks. Today, when we look back, it is hard to imagine that Managua of 1930 with its low horizon, its aligned tile roofs, and its contained rhythm. The city seemed stable, almost predictable. But on the morning of March 31st, 1931, that sensation broke in a matter of seconds. The earthquake shook the capital with a force that exceeded any forecast. The adobe walls gave way. The facades opened into deep cracks, and many of the traditional constructions collapsed onto streets that until the day before had been a scene of routine and commerce. Dust covered the urban center, and the familiar profile of the city changed forever. In the middle of that devastation, the steel structure of the Santiago Cathedral remained standing, while heavy masonry buildings collapsed. The metallic framework brought from Belgium resisted the impact. That which many considered an interminable work became suddenly an unexpected symbol of solidity and permanence. The cathedral was not yet finished, but it had already acquired a different meaning. Its survival was not just a technical datum, it was a powerful image in the middle of the destruction. What had been a motive for a joke came to represent resistance. What seemed slow and uncertain acquired a historical dimension. With the passing of the years, the temple was finally concluded and inaugurated in 1938, however. Its identity was marked from that earthquake. It was not only a religious building, it was a witness of a city that had fallen and began to rebuild itself. Looking today at that period allows one to understand the contrast with greater clarity. In 1930, people lived concentrated on their daily routine, oblivious to any idea of immediate rupture, foreign occupation. Incipient modernity and the slow construction of the temple were part of the present. Nobody could measure the historical weight of those apparently ordinary days. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of that Managua. Cities do not know when they are on the edge of a decisive change. They function, they grow, and they converse as if the balance were permanent. Only with the distance of time do we understand that even the quietest years can be marking the beginning of a definitive transformation. In 1930, Managua simply lived between the morning coffee, the murmur of the market, and the always active square. The city advanced without thinking too much about what would come later. In the center, the metallic silhouette of the Santiago Cathedral grew little by little, integrated into the landscape as if it had always been there. Nobody imagined that slow, almost discreet work would end up being a symbol of resistance. The steel brought from Belgium did not only support a structure, it also supported the memory of a city that changed forever. Perhaps that is why when we look back, we understand that even the quietest days can be loaded with meaning. Remembering the Managua of 1930 is not only looking at a distant past, it is recognizing a time in which life transpired with closeness, with direct conversation, with a silent confidence in continuity, a time that today seems distant. But that still resonates in those who value the simple, and this journey allowed you to walk through those dirt streets. Listen to the bells and see that cathedral slowly rise. Perhaps it is worth it to continue touring other eras together. Tell me from which city you are watching this video and which decade you would like to explore in the next, because while someone remembers, those cities of the past continue breathing step by step in our shared memory. This video was created with artificial intelligence to remember what Managua was like in 1930, rescuing images, habits, and sensations of the past.